Hi everyone, I'm Liz Mosley. I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise. I'm going to be the host for today's Open News Thinking. This charming man, of course, what could we be talking about? Anything else but former Prime Minister David Cameron. We're going to go back to Greensill and lobbying and all of that to see what's happened that is new and what we've learned and what might happen next. And then I think in the sort of second chunk of the conversation today, we're going to take a look at Bidenomics and the UK and US sort of exit routes out of lockdown and policy decisions that are being made and what's working and what isn't, because the sort of gap seems to be opening up between those two approaches and their results. As always, please do join in if there's something particular you want to talk about today. This is our opportunity to pitch news story ideas, to explore things we've already done. If you've listened already to either of the Thinking with James Harding audio stories that we've released this week, yesterday's on Rosemont's Fall, today's on cancel culture, if you've listened to them, I'd love to know what you think. Tom Goulding is in the chat, so please do join in with Tom. And I'm going to come straight, I think, to Chris Cook, who's written today's Sensemaker, the sort of top bit of which is about David Cameron and Greensill. And you sort of list out, Chris, the things we've learned that are new or conclusive at the beginning, and then you go on to sort of say, why has this happened and what do we do about it? Can you do the list first, just so we can kind of orient ourselves to what we've learned now?
Oh man, I have to say, can I, am I allowed to refer to a document?
You can refer to a document, that's fine. Nobody will notice, just riff on it.
Slightly delay while my computer catches up with this plan. I think the first big thing is we didn't realize before all this how much influence and reach Lex Greensill, this Australian financier, had in Whitehall prior to Cameron's defenestration. We didn't know until all this about how Cameron was using his influence to lobby. You know, he's texting the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's texting a guy called Sheridan Westlake, who is a sort of long-serving special advisor in Downing Street, who sort of owes his career in quite a fundamental sense to Cameron. We didn't know before this that Cameron was going off into the desert with Lex Greensill to lobby Mohammed bin Salman. It is worth, if you haven't seen it, looking at the Wall Street Journal photo.
Oh my God.
Of them. There's an amazing clip of Lex Greensill. His whole thing is I'm a farmer and I'm doing this to help farmers. There's a clip of him that someone has pulled out saying, from a sort of marketing video saying, I'm a farmer, I'm really uncomfortable in a suit. And then cutting to him sitting in the desert in a suit. Like, this guy is like, it's fraud all the way down, right? The other thing we've learned is that Cameron is really bad, not just at being Prime Minister, he's also very bad as a lobbyist. So if you think the job of a lobbyist is to make it appear that the government has, of its own accord, comes the decision that you want your company to get, right? You don't want to leave a paper trail, right? You don't want to have the situation where the Chancellor is saying, I've just had a call from David Cameron, whatever, you know. And you also don't want the ministers to find themselves in a position where they're having to defend odd conduct in a court. The whole thing, public law is all built on the side of reasonableness. And actually, if at any point you're saying, well, I got a call from the former Prime Minister and he said it would help his company, you're in very bad, you're a very bad place. And he screwed basically all the basic rules of basic lobbying. He doesn't understand. And finally, Cameron's thing is, well, I shouldn't have texted, right? I should have written a formal letter. No. The issue is that you're a former, like, look at what Gordon Brown does now. Like, you sit quietly on your own, you make enough money from speeches, and you stay out of lobbying. My view on all this is that we don't need more lobbying laws. We need a good Freedom of Information Act. And we need to, and the trying to write rules on who is and who isn't a lobbyist is a fool's errand. The answer is having really, really hard transparency laws that are hard to evade, because then you'll get to stuff. And hard transparency laws mean, so at the moment, any claim of that someone isn't complying with the Freedom of Information Act, you've only got, it's a really narrow idea of what not complying is. So you can, for example, you can basically lie about what you think the law is and sort of just delay, and that's sort of fine. There's no punishment for that. you've only got 6 months to bring a case. The punishments, as Andrew Goodwood said, are stupid. Like they're basically small fines. They should, given that almost everyone who has to comply with the FOI Act is a public servant, just fire them, right? Make it an immediate disqualification offence. Like as soon as you start firing the permanent secretary of the cabinet office because his officials aren't complying, people will work out how to deal with all this stuff quite quickly. And then, yeah, I think you also need an information commissioner who's not answerable to ministers, but answerable to Parliament.
So Chris, I can see James has just asked a question in the chat, which I'll come to in just a sec. There's a couple of things. So the point about giving the freedom of information, giving the information commissioner more teeth and a much stronger sort of legislative backing is one thing, but turkeys don't vote for Christmas, do they? Is that the issue here?
Yeah. So it's, I think the kindest way to think of it is there are a group of basically journalists who are complete patsies for executive power, right? And you can spot them because they're all against the Freedom of Information Act. And there's this whole thing of like, serious people think that transparency in government is really damaging to what serious chaps on their own have to do. And if like the little people don't have the capacity to understand the tough decisions that we have to make, that's the big problem, right? It's this attitude, like Cameron has said it, Blair has said it, like that freedom of information gets in the way of executive power. And you're like, yes, that is what it is supposed to do. Yeah. And it is a misunderstanding of what the Act was intended to do to not see that as a huge benefit. And I think that's the big problem, right? More than anything, it's this idea that sensible people think the FOI Act is an impediment to what serious chaps have to do on their own, which sometimes means calling up their chums.
Okay.
James has asked about like
the other company,
his other commercial, his other commercial interests. So the interesting one is Illumina, because Illumina make the chips behind, like, if you've ever had your genome sequenced by something like 23andMe, Illumina make the chips that do all that. Like Illumina basically have a monopoly on the chips that read DNA off swabs.
Okay.
And Britain has a massive genome reading program through Genomics England. We did this thing of sequencing in like a huge number of people. We kind of would have to do a lot of business with Illumina anyway. So I'm sort of interested in that because I suspect it's that there's kind of no competition for what they do. So it'll be interesting to see whether I don't know why you'd hire an ex-prime minister, given that you have a monopoly.
Yeah, what advice is he giving them? Helping them develop their chips, I imagine.
I think we should also be clear, these people don't have advice to give, right? Like that you and I would consider meaningful. No one rings up George Osborne for his view on macroeconomics, right? No one is interested in what George Osborne thinks about the economy. Like he's got a history degree. Like he doesn't have any inside information. He doesn't have any analytical capability that anyone else has. He has a sort of columnisty understanding of politics at like quite an evolved level. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer, but they're buying what they hope is going to be useful access. That's what so Stephen McPartland, who is the MP for Stevenage, right, who is a guy who has no prospect of a serious political career, is paid £36,000 a year by Furniture Village, a company that he has in an industry which he has no insight into, just so they can have an MP who can ask parliamentary questions and run an APPG and do lobbying for them. It is just an accepted part of how Britain works. And Stevenage is fine. It just happens to be where the furniture lobbying institutions are based.
James, you've got your yellow hand.
So I just wanted to ask Chris, just the Illumina contract, there's something very odd about that penultimate paragraph in the statement, partly because it's this phrase, my commercial interests include. So I don't know if those are all of the commercial interests, right? But the just sticking with the Illumina one for a start, it seems to me as though they won an extension of their contract, or at least reading the coverage today, they won an extension of their contract in 2019, uncontested, because by then they were the only provider of services to Genomics England, which had been established while Cameron was Prime Minister. So isn't there an issue here which is different from the Greensill one, i.e. the extent to which you could be brought on and into that company as part of a way of securing the ongoing, either as a way of securing the ongoing contract or as a reward for having got the contracts in the first place?
So
I just
so
wonder how you read that with what you're saying about transparency.
So I think there is a problem. So the only solution to that is for us to see everything that was done in relation to Illumina and the setting up of Genomics England under Cameron, which is 10 years ago really now, and the allegation is much more serious in a set actually really than the Greensill allegation. That the insinuation you're making that you could literally be setting up institutions, giving out contracts, and then in the hope of enriching yourself in the future.
Yeah.
But that definitely happens, but I don't think it happens with ministers. There's one case which Adam Glass, our lawyer, will be pleased that I probably shouldn't name, where there's one really egregious and obvious example of where a senior official did loads of work to build up a particular line of business and give particular advantages, and then immediately walked out straight into the main beneficiary of it. And that happens at a sort of like a few layers down. But I don't think it happens with ministers so much because it'd be pretty obvious.
But is it kind of, I'm sorry, Liz, forgive me. Is there, Chris, is this ethically or behaviourally different from Tony Blair and giving speeches, advisory work for big banks?
I think so. This is different because this is, so first of all, there's no suggestion. I don't think anyone thinks Tony Blair has made a penny out of the British taxpayer. Right, that's a big thing, right? He's made all his money from giving advice to people outside. Similarly, George Osborne has given, I think, my pension fund happens to be, unfortunately, invested in BlackRock, and I would like to know why I'm paying so much money for basically an Evening Standard columnist advice, right? But that is not the same.
Come on.
That is not, that is not the same as getting money from the taxpayer.
No, but yeah. But your point is that both George Osborne and Tony Blair have been paid a lot of money for their advice, but not for
lobbying.
Government. Yeah.
I mean, as far as we know. I mean, I think I suspect the point of paying George Osborne that amount of money, as I say, because you can get it for free if you walk down to the Tube, is the advice he's giving, or in the Evening Standard. I think the point of getting George Osborne is partly that BlackRock probably did think. These companies do think you might get special access and you might get sort of special information and you might get gossip that might be helpful.
But hold on a second. Hold on, Chris. The problem here is that you can't expect people who've left government not to get jobs. The question is there only skill access? Because you could quite easily make the argument, no, look, the reality is you may not respect George Osborne as an economist, but you can see that he'll have political judgment that's valuable. Right, and you can see why you would pay for that political judgment. It's different from political access because it was part of the argument. Just your note about we need to fix transparency. I think fixing transparency may not be enough here, because there's part of the issue which is, should you just not be allowed to be a form of government that is involved in efforts to secure government contracts? Isn't that?
I think that's basically Gordon Brown's proposal. I mean, to your point, right? Gordon Brown is the counterexample, and Theresa May actually.
Yeah,
they've gone off and they've made money from giving speeches and being a former prime minister, and it's all, I mean, it's dignified in a sort of sense, like it's an old-fashioned way of raising cash. Like no one has, I mean, and actually Obama is quite an interesting example. They've actually set up, a production company. They're doing things and they're sort of getting involved in commerce. They're making a living, but they're not trying to get money out of the federal government or That's I think is Cameron's core thing. Is Cameron is no one would buy David Cameron's judgment, right? So they're buying his access. And that is the core thing here. Like the point of David Cameron's book, the long David Cameron book is George Osborne is the clever one in this relationship and people are paying him for his judgment and no one would pay for his judgment. They're buying his contact book. Actually, and I think it is remarkable how little David Cameron understands about how government works is one of the other things that's emerged from this. So one of the things that used to emerge when he was prime minister was that people in departments would complain continuously that he would make pledges they would have to find a way of legally making possible. So one of them was a he promised a kid they would get a specific drug that the NHS was not at that point funding. And the problem is you can't just say, oh, we will give this one drug to this one kid. You have to come up with a rule book that means that that kid ends up with that drug, that any child in a similar situation would end up with that drug. And also you have to do it in a way that doesn't bankrupt the NHS by just handing out drugs willy-nilly. But he used to do this stuff all the time of just like, oh yeah, why don't we do that? And then officials have to work out a way of sort of fitting it together. Because he'd never worked in a proper department, he didn't really understand how you make decisions. So he's a terrible lobbyist.
And Chris, sorry, but can I get one other just practical thing? Sorry, Liz, one other thing. What is the place of the text message in the world of the FOI?
Everything is covered. If it's government business, it's covered. If it's your own phone, it's covered. So the law has two ideas, right? One is scope, which is to say, is this basically related to the business of government? Is this related to the public authority for which I'm working's work? And if it is, and effectively, however you do things, and the FOI Act is actually quite well written in that it doesn't talk about media at all. It just says, is it relevant? So if a minister uses their government email account to organise dinner with their wife, it is not covered by the FOI Act because that is not government business. But conversely, if they text someone about lobbying, it is absolutely covered by the FOI Act. It is unequivocal. It is. I have personally been to court over this. It is beyond reproach. There's a second thing.
And Chris, what happens if you delete the text?
So that's the second idea in the FOI Act is the idea of information being held, which is to say, does the department literally possess it, or does someone possess it on their behalf? And if you have it on your mobile phone, your private mobile phone, you're deemed to hold it on behalf of the department. If you delete it after a request has been made, you've committed a criminal offence under Section 77 of the Act. If you delete it before an event has been made, that's plausibly record-keeping management. But you're supposed to be able to prove why you deleted it and when you deleted it. So if you're a public official covered by the FOI Act, what you're supposed to do is maintain what's called a deletion log, which is effectively a dossier that says, once a month, I clean out my old emails, I get rid of like the meeting notifications, I delete my text messages, blah, 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 so that you can say if someone comes afterwards, where did you delete this? You've got like a document record that sort of shows it. In practice, no one ever does that. No one has ever done that. And the Information Commissioner is such a patsy that they've never brought a case about it. The Information Commissioner has never, I brought a Section 77 case against Michael Gove in 2011, which is to say I was able to prove that he was deliberately lying about not holding information that I could prove he held. The Information Commissioner didn't know who the case was against, and they thought it was against a local authority. So they said to me, oh, well, you have to give us the full details and then we'll get a warrant. And then I told them who it was, and they said, oh, well, we'll write a really stern letter. Like, they're just scared of Whitehall. They're just patsies. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
And
I'm
really,
muting.
no, please. It's absolutely fine. This is the game. Chris, I've got a question for you, and then I'll bring in a couple of other people who've made some comments. I'm loving George Osborne buying baked beans in Bruton. I think that's a brilliant little vignette. Which is, and I think it's not a hard question really, rather a softer one, but which it does come down to judgment really. And there are obvious things, and you've listed them out in Sense Maker, the specific things which are many of them issues with David Cameron's conduct over this. But the thing about it that I can't get my head around, I can't understand, is it doesn't seem to be a consensus between David Cameron or the Chancellor or any number of other people who are connected to Rachel Lester of what the problem really is. So it seemed like the Chancellor with the text messages would seem to think by releasing these, I'm going to, absolve myself of any wrongdoing. And that was a bit off. And then Cameron's statement also, as you've said, seems to suggest that he just kind of doesn't really see the issue. So what is that just because these people just don't really, is that a moral failing, if you like, on the part of the individuals, or is it a problem of the systems that are meant to sort of determine what is and isn't okay?
So I think the Sunak thing is sort of faintly funny because he was obliged by law to release his text messages, right? So they cooked up a really stupid excuse as to why they didn't have to release Cameron's text messages, which is that they literally claim that they fear that if they release David Cameron's text messages, David Cameron could take them to court and that a judge would rule there'd been an actionable breach of confidence, and therefore he would be able to win money from the government from them for releasing his lobbying text messages. Like,
circular reference.
Do we think this is serious? So I think on the Sunak thing, like, he was obliged to by law is the short answer.
Okay.
And there is no way of really getting around what he did, even if they can sort of try and cook up something for Cameron. I think it's partly like it's sort of self-justification after the fact, isn't it, with Cameron? Like, he's just he can't. If he had said, well, yeah, the problem is obviously that they've hired me to do this. He is I shouldn't have taken the job. I shouldn't take the money. You shouldn't hire people like me to do this kind of stuff. There's obviously a problem because that's what they, it's not just this one contract either. He's obviously doing this for several people.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much, Matt D'Ancona. I think Number 10 is delighted that the heat is on Sunak and Cameron. Talk to us about that. Hiya.
Hello. As the author of a widely remaindered book on Cameron's coalition, I feel I have skin in the game, though I'm not necessarily proud to admit it. I think Chris's takedown is unimprovable, really. So I'm not going to try and emulate that at all. Except to say that I find it very interesting that the 2014 Lobbying Act that was passed by the coalition made it, in retrospect, inexplicably the case that people who were employees of companies were not covered by the lobbying rules, which seemed to me, when you now think that Cameron, Osborne, Nick Clegg at Facebook all work for big companies and do lots of lobbying for them, or have done, is at least suggests that this was at least at the back of their minds, shall we say? Let's put it charitably. On the here and now, clearly Cameron's corpse is going to be exhumed repeatedly and dragged around the marketplace almost indefinitely, I think. And it will do, I suspect, irreparable damage to his, or remainder of his reputation post-Brexit. But I also think it's interesting how it interacts with contemporary politics, because look, the government is not delighted that there's a sort of resurgence of Tory sleaze headlines and all that sort of thing. But on the other hand, those who want Boris to be in Number 10 for a long time and have bad memories of his long-running rivalry and feud with Boris, and look at Rishi Sunak as the box fresh alternative, who is, very, very, unambiguously preening and presenting himself as the alternative. I don't think it bothers those around Boris one bit to see Cameron and Sunak being discomforted. So if you're just looking at the court politics of this, which is, only one aspect of what is actually, in truth, and as Chris showed, is a huge structural problem at the heart of how we govern, what happens to prime ministers when they leave office, the sanctions to which they are subject, the transparency regime to which they're subject. Couldn't agree with Chris more on that. But nonetheless, there is an element of Whitehall farce in the fact that behind their hands there is just a little bit of sniggering going on in Number 10 about this. It's from the point of view of Team Boris, as reconfigured since Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane departed. This is not there are some upsides to what is, at least ostensibly, a really bad news story for the Conservative Party.
Thanks, Matt. And Tom's asked a really good question, which I was going to come on to anyway, which is really kind of what happens next. So, Chris, you called the inquiry independent-ish because the chap who's put in charge of it is independent-ish. What is reasonable to expect? How long will it take? Is anything going to happen? What's a good sort of expectation management job we can do on the outcome of that?
We also know that the guy they've appointed to do it is first of all, they're sort of a pal of the government, right? He's a non-executive director of the business department, and fundamentally you do not get put into those jobs unless you are like a potential patsy at least, right? They're not there to challenge ministers; they're there to do what ministers want. Right? They're not really non-executives in a sort of conventional sense. The people who get put into those are donors and pals. Nick Timothy's a non-executive director of another. He's also a guy who's been an opponent of attempts to regulate lobbying before, so I'd be quite suspicious of its ability to draw broad conclusions. I would also point out, like the executive, like the ministerial code, and doesn't exist to get ministers in trouble, right? Like the executive doesn't do things that will cause the executive trouble as a rule, and they see this as a solution to a problem. It is unlikely to be that they think the problem is that it's too easy for ex-politicians to make money, right? Mm-hmm. I'd be quite surprised if it's more than like quite a shallow examination of the issues. And I think the prospect of the executive coming to the conclusion it needs better transparency, we need to be able to get into Boris Johnson's WhatsApp groups, is pretty low.
So it's not a real inquiry, really?
Not really. It's supposed to be like no, not really. No, he's got no staff. Like, all this stuff these things are it's quite a big question they've asked him to tackle, and he's not really got real expertise. He's got a prior position that's pretty negative, and he's been chosen from the sort of group of he's been chosen as a pro-government friendly-ish to ministers person.
Oh man. You've not made me feel good in the first 29 minutes of this Open News meeting, Chris. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry on behalf of everybody.
I'm usually such a ray of sunshine about that.
I know, exactly. You are. I'm going to bring a couple of contributions from members and people listening in just before we move into Bidenomics. Andrew Bruce, I've noted you've made a little comment here about character and integrity and what people should be doing. Are you there, Andrew?
Yeah, yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can see you well.
Yeah, thanks very much. No, I just think there's real questions to be asked here about the role of prime ministers in the post-prime ministerial period. And I do think of someone like Jimmy Carter, who has gained a great reputation for himself and done really, really important work in so many areas, observing elections, conflict resolution work. I think he's worked the Carter Centers have worked to eradicate the guinea worm, I think it's called in West Africa, for example. And there just seems to be a real contrast here between the role he's played and then to see these pictures of David Cameron sitting in a tent in Saudi Arabia and lobbying in the way in which he does. Maybe there's questions for us to ask about trying to create more of a formalized and useful role for former prime ministers in British society as well.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I could just see Chris again singing the praises of Gordon Brown and his exemplary ex-prime minister ship. And can I just bring in Dylan Evans? You've asked a question really about the sort of existing legislation about lobbying and whether it's done more harm than good.
Yeah, can you see me?
I can't see you. I can hear you though.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There you are.
Yeah, I just was thinking, because I think the thing that I saw most often in the sort of rebuttal to this stuff is that people are saying, "Oh, he didn't break any rules," and the obvious question is then that, well, are the rules any good? Mm. If the rules are no use, then not breaking them doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Dylan. I think that's kind of where Chris started off, which is it's not about trying to tighten up what is and isn't lobbying, but about trying to tighten up the sort of transparency infrastructure that sort of underpins it in order that it encourages people to sort of act with greater impunity. It's 1:30. I'm going to leave David Cameron behind momentarily and go over the Atlantic a little bit. And if my colleague Paul is there, Paul, are you there? Calling Paul. If we can bring Paul.
Hey Liz, sorry, I was just unmuted.
Oh, that's okay. Nice to see you. So Paul is part of a Team SenseMaker, and we were going to take a look at the US, UK, and I guess Europe, the gap between how we're emerging from the pandemic, if I dare say emerging. It's probably a bit previous to say emerging, but how this sort of gap is opening up now, why that is, and how we feel about it. Just give us a bit of context for this.
Sure. So the interesting thing I think is if you look at daily COVID cases per capita, now you do see a gap. But when Biden first took office in November, they were actually almost exactly the same. So the rate of daily new COVID cases. And they only began to diverge because the UK implemented that December-ish lockdown. And by December, or rather by January, they both peaked at around the same level. First, because the UK obviously exited its lockdown, but then because in January, Biden launched this, what he called the America Rescue Plan, which is one of those great American policy names. But broadly, the difference between the two countries is that ability to do very broad federal national lockdowns, and the rest of the picture from January is that difference, where the US has been trying to manage keeping an economy and country open and running without locking down, in contrast to this country. And the plan, though, is quite similar in many ways to what's been happening here. So mass vaccinations, economic relief to the unemployed and hard-hit households, business loans, that kind of thing. So it's kind of, it all hinges in broad terms on that difference in lockdown policy. For me, the kind of really interesting thing is not so much the difference in COVID outcomes, because I think that's too early to say, but what the policy response in both countries has required so far and what will require. So for the Biden-Harris administration, for example, raising the revenue they need to manage their plan is calls for these enormous changes to the country's tax structure. So raising corporate tax to 28%, the highest level since 1968. And it's not a coincidence that at the same time, Biden is the driving force behind this attempt to find a deal on what he calls a global minimum tax. Because of course, the real problem is there's no point in raising corporate tax at home when a company can book profits in the Bahamas.
Yeah.
So that's the kind, for me, that's the really, really interesting part of this comparative policy experiment. What it means again for COVID, I can't tell yet. Above my pay grade, I'm afraid.
So Paul,
I think James is on the call.
just to be really clear, the COVID rates per 100,000 people in the UK and the US, you said they were broadly the same, and did you say November?
That's right.
And then now they are.
Oh, so now there's a big difference. So in the US, they're about 10 times per person, 10 times as higher.
Because they haven't locked down in the way that the UK has locked down.
I think if there is one single important reason, it's that.
And the vaccination rates, again, this is a statistic that has whizzed past in front of my eyes, so I don't know if it's right. I think vaccination rates, I mean, it seems extraordinary for me to say that because America is huge. We're kind of pound for pound. They've done about half the adult population as well, or is that wrong?
I think you're right. I think the vaccination program has been increasingly successful. I'm just thinking now of other I mean, relatively minor differences. They have this problem in the US around even simple restrictions, right? Like wearing masks. I remember one of the first things Biden had to do is say wearing a mask isn't a political issue. But I mean, these things are hard to quantify.
Yeah.
Um,
But economically, the US is it not looking pretty good? Again, this is sort of not sort of hugely robust research, but the sort of economic picture, the story of the sort of route out, there seemed to be sort of optimism and buoyancy around this $1.9 trillion, and there'll be another wave of new policy announcements, but in general, it's looking good in spite of the COVID gap.
Yeah, so it's a huge stimulus, and it was in this country as well, and there is optimism here as well. So the Bank of England predicts a return to pre-pandemic economic levels by December, which is a pretty rapid recovery. And that's both because of the size of the stimulus, but the nature of the shock, in that it was this sort of totally out of nowhere disease that shut down the economy, unlike, say, the credit crunch in 2009, which sort of choked the economy in various parts and took a much longer time to recover from.
Yeah, interesting. James, you want to come in on this? James, is he there?
Well, one is I think that I'm really keen to think about how we talk about this, and maybe it's just more in sense maker emails, or maybe, Liz, we should go after it in a thinking, but there's something going badly wrong, I think, in our journalism around what's happening in the US. So if we couldn't move for talking about Trump, right, who wasn't really doing anything but making a large amount of noise. And in any way you look at it, the American Rescue Plan, the American Jobs Plan, the American Families Plan, the three signature initiatives of Joe Biden, right? Putting aside the fact that they each commit roughly $2 trillion, right? So they're a level of spending that is just colossal. They're also a progressive radicalism i.e. they are kind of big government interventions. The American Families Plan is going to be a moment where the US federal government is stepping in on preschool education funding, on reform of healthcare. This, the rescue plan itself is just a huge distribution of money. And politically, I mean, even if there's a whole debate about the economics of it. Is it going to trickle into the markets and make a lot of, people who've got access to markets and, shares and bonds, etc., extremely wealthy? Even if you don't want to engage in that kind of nitty gritty, just as a political exercise, this is a colossal departure. And we're not really talking about it because Donald Trump isn't tweeting. And it feels to me as though there's an interesting lesson here in our politics, which is it seems as though Biden had the experience of bipartisanship in 2008-9, tried to do business with the Republicans, thought that they nickel and dimed the stimulus package then, and then criticized its outcome. And so he's gone, having been expected to be a bipartisan, former senator deal maker, actually being, listen, it's my way or the highway, I'm going to do my own thing. And it's just hugely interesting. And sooner or later, UK politics is going to wake up, and I would have thought either left or right is going to wake up and say there's a new model of non-partisanship, which is, really interventionist on the economy, that is on the heels of Biden. And it's going to be really interesting, not least, I think, Liz, because it feels as though they're making a call on the amount of money they're willing to borrow and spend. And so far, the markets are rewarding them for it. And they're punishing Europe, which is being kind of quote unquote more prudent. So all of this feels like it's big and chewy, and other people who will understand the economics better than me and the politics better than me will probably have better insights than that. It just feels like it's one of those things where it's not Trump tweeting, but it is significant.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm interested to the sort of question of why, like you say, it's not Trump tweeting. It's not an instant hit. It's not white bread news, you know, you can get an instant hit, but you feel hungry 2 minutes afterwards. But how you would package that and sell that, the thing that you've just summarized, to get people interested in it, is not immediately obvious to me, because I think people think, you know, there's a big chunk of this country that felt that when Biden won the election, they thought, well, we don't have to worry about America for a bit. That's probably okay. And I think that is, you know, as far as people think about it. Zav's just put a note. I know you can't come on camera, Zav, because you're in several people here on meetings, but you're talking about this rule in New York, which doesn't seem to make any sense to me either. We're in New York currently, I'm guessing you have to wear a mask outdoors in New York, but you can have restaurants open for indoor dining. Interesting. And then can I also bring in Tom Goulding? You put a note in here about Detroit and these sort of state specific rules.
Yeah, I'm actually not really qualified to talk about it.
None of us are qualified, Tom. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I just saw some news stories this morning about, obviously, you know, for governors of blue states, they can less easily now paint themselves as fighting the good fight against Trump, who's no longer in office, like Cuomo did in New York. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, that relationship between Biden and the kind of local governments across the country. And I think that's definitely something we should, you know, keep an eye on.
Yeah, interesting. We're going to bring Matt back in. Matt, we talked a lot about American politics, American culture. We did a run of think-ins, 6 of them, I think. And James is right. We have scarcely uttered a word, actually. I don't just mean officially in Tortoise sort of output. I mean between us, you know, it's sort of much quieter. What's your sort of take on how one would package what is or isn't interesting about what's happening across the pond?
Well, I think it's a battle, actually. I think that it's what's interesting is that what Biden represents in lots of ways is I mean, to James's point, is an attempt to totally ditch the bipartisanship of previous Democrat administrations and go for you know, what is to some extent, you know, the much vaunted radical center. And you know, to centrist dads like me, this is obviously catnip, but it is a battle, because whilst I totally agree we have to really avoid the gravitational pull back to Trump, because he was frankly easy to write about. You know, he was a showbiz personality. He delivered the goods every morning. You know, he did the nonsense maker every morning in his tweet. You know, every morning there it was, the nonsense maker, and it was kind of there in your inbox, and you had a story. He was very user friendly to journalists, dangerously so. And so we have to be wary of carrying on following him out of bad habits. But the battle that he pursued continues to be fought, both within the Republican Party and more worryingly outside it, in the growth of militias, in the retreat of the far right, the kind of forces that were involved in the assault on the Capitol on January the 6th. They're still there. And so I think the way to frame it is that this is a continuing struggle. You know, it's a struggle between constitutional, policy-led, essentially, you know, evidence-based, sensible policy, and the politics of identity, culture, and nativism. And that is not going to be something that disappears just because Biden won the election. And it is going to be, I'm sure, a very significant dimension to the 2024 race, whoever it is between. One assumes that the front runner for the Democratic nomination is Kamala. I suspect Trump is diminishingly likely to be the candidate, but he may be the kingmaker, the queenmaker. So it's to me, the tension between those two Americas is very compelling.
Matt, in peacetime, I'm trying to go back in my mind. Obviously, every time there's a presidential election, it's, you know, if you live in this country, it's easy to be interested in and engaged in that process. But in the bit that happens in between, I'm trying to think, what are the things in ordinary peacetime that American politics has registered over here? There's the obvious sort of, there's the Lewinsky thing, but I can't think how much in general people in this country are interested in American political and economic policy.
I guess if you're right, that let's park scandals, you know, because they're in and of themselves, that, you know, they come and go. I think there are two things. One is a kind of general sense of trajectory. So Clinton's Democrats in the 90s were profoundly influential upon New Labour, and Philip Gould and others, you know, went out to Little Rock and met George Stephanopoulos and James Carville, and you know, they drank the Kool-Aid, and you know, it buttressed their third way New Labour instincts, and to a lesser extent, and this is so forgotten because everyone associates George W. Bush with dropping bombs and starting wars. Early George Bush was based on this whole notion of compassionate conservatism, which did feed into what then became the Portilloite Cameroon kind of modernization program. So, which is a long-winded way of saying that there is this kind of, or has been, this close relationship between the kind of political culture in DC and the political culture in Westminster. The second big area, which again it's very interesting to see where this goes, was geostrategic, which was that whatever else we thought about our relationship with America, it was kind of etched into the rules that when America went into action militarily, Britain wouldn't be far behind. And that assumption, although it wasn't always pursued, was very badly dented by Iraq, and collapsed over Syria. And so the interesting question is, A, does Biden really want to renew, in any meaningful sense, America's old role as policeman of the world? Not conspicuously so, but he's not an isolationist in the way that Trump was. And if he does Boris Johnson want to follow him? And I think the answer to those questions is not clear, and they're really interesting questions. The relationship between DC and Number 10 is not especially warm for all sorts of obvious reasons, and so we can't assume that, you know, that which Biden does will be emulated by, you know, conservatives of any stripe, or apparently anyone around Keir Starmer. I'm very surprised by, perhaps the pandemic has been a break on it, but I'm surprised by the lack of kind of visible public showy enthusiasm in the Starmer camp for what Biden is doing. I mean, it's such an easy play. It really is.
Interesting. Thanks, Matt. I'm going to come back to Paul, because Paul, maybe the hook here for us is one of the things you said at the beginning when we started talking about this, which is what I do know from Tortoise members, Tortoise thinkings, and previous Tortoise work is if sort of American domestic political and economic policy is hard to get people over here excited about and engaged in, people over here can be very excited about and engaged in political and economic policy of the big tech companies, which brings us back to your point about this global minimum tax. It could be the connecting factor between those two things, and that's ongoing work for us at Tortoise. Is that something we can drill into?
I think it is. I think I mean, the prospect of it is still, you know, there's a good chance it still won't happen. You know, the deal has to be negotiated between 135 countries through the OECD. But if the US is behind it, which apparently was the main barrier before Biden, then the chances improve. I think the implications of it, if it does succeed, are really significant. Of course, not just for the US, like you said, but for every party to the agreement. and for the way we structure economies, so the way we set corporate and income taxes, the way we govern, because an enormous amount of tax revenue is lost when big companies like Google or Facebook earn all their revenue in the US or Australia or France or wherever, but book it in an offshore haven. And I think it will address major problems around inequality and the levels of tax rates we levy.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'm going to bring in Emily Ben. Are you there?
I am, yeah, hello.
Hi, Emily. How are you doing? Nice to see you.
Very well, thanks, Liz. How are you?
All right, thank you. Yeah, you're talking about voting on party lines in the States, and you're talking about Labour as well. So
yeah, I was just talking about how obviously the major parts of Biden's economic recovery were passed on very, very strict party lines in Congress. That's not that unusual in the recent trends of US political history. If you look at votes that have gone on strictly party lines, obviously the Affordable Care Act in 2010 being a very obvious one. At the height of the Newt Gingrich Plan for America against Clinton in the mid-1990s, you had another big kind of rise in party line votes. So this is not completely unprecedented in periods of big American political history. And I just put a link to the Brookings data because it's very interesting as you plot along kind of periods of the beginning of George Bush's presidency. For a number of reasons, there were far fewer votes just on party lines. There was a much bigger increase in bipartisanship in both houses of Congress. And if you look at Senate confirmations of Supreme Court nominees, again, you see that trend has got worse actually lately. So, you don't get many people on the other side of the aisle voting for Supreme Court nominations. So it's interesting how it tracks. And the only other point I was making is that Matt was talking about the Labour Party relationship with President Biden and his administration. Obviously, the Labour Party is under very different leadership than this time a year ago, but there were plenty of people in the Labour Party very, very critical of Joe Biden's candidature.
Yeah.
And serious and influential figures in the Labour Party at that time saying how, I remember the words, he was a joke candidate, saying how useless it was. He was the words, the equivalent of a boring centrist. He's never going to get anything done. Clearly, those has proved to be not correct at all. And the guys clearly got a very long political history, so they were just going back and attacking pretty much everything he'd ever done. I don't think that enamored the Labour Party particularly to figures in the Biden administration. And Matt mentioned that, and I know there's some friends who work there too, that they're not huge fans of Boris Johnson, not least because of his past comments about Joe Biden's former boss, President Obama, very well known and not easily forgotten. But I don't think people forget the kind of left's attitude in Britain at the beginning of the Biden campaign either. In my opinion, is it was just a very short-sighted attack and political attack that some on the left were using against Joe Biden in the UK that wasn't helpful, not least given what he's managed to achieve already.
So in spite of the fact that the Labour Party is under new management, it doesn't count because people have long memories for something like that.
I'm not saying it doesn't count. It's just, the Labour Party going, and the particular figures were quite public in its view of that type of politics, but it's a very, very different type of politics. I mean, Joe Biden won the election not by doing a type of political campaign that the kind of previous Labour Party leadership would have done in a general election campaign. We've seen two very obvious different examples. So that's my point. My point is that, to be honest, I also am not entirely sure that people in the Biden presidential administration know much about the Labour Party or its leadership. Or care. So one can indeed overestimate how much they care about the internal of Labour Party politics. My friends might ask me what's going on, but I don't think they really know. They know who Boris Johnson is, again, for obvious reasons. But one can overestimate. But it is if the Labour Party is going to form links with Joe Biden in a way that Matt talked about in New Labour, I mean, it's going to take a huge, serious effort. But the links were so deep and powerful between the New Dems and the DLC, and there are not just the individuals, but the institutions. There's a lot there, and the institution of American politics and American policy and vision. There are so many things to get on. It will help when they can actually go there.
Yeah, indeed. As Zav has just said, it's easy to forget the UK has just had one of the strictest lockdowns in the world, and actually listing out and reading back. I'm on my second day on the trot in the newsroom here in central London today, and the feeling of London and people sort of just emerging a little bit is so different. When you read how it's been in New York, I don't know if Zav's able to say how long it's been like that in New York for, or if New York has ever really locked down. I don't know. We sort of forget how much we've become used to really not being able to do anything at all. It's interesting. Just a time for a couple more quick contributions, I hope. Andrew Girdwood, let me just ask you quickly about this digital services tax. And I know you know lots about the ins and outs of this sort of stuff. What was this particular point about the trade conflict in the US by the digital services tax?
The UK introduced a tax on companies like Google and Facebook on the advertising services. It was 2%, I think, and Google simply just passed it on to the customers, so they're not paying, we are. And now, in retaliation, I believe the Biden administration is looking at taxing some British imports. So as far as I can see, maybe the Treasury coffers are boosted a little bit, but the American companies that have been targeted are not affected at all, but the whole UK might be negatively affected, and trade war between the UK and the US.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I'm going to come back, if I can, to Phoebe, who, if she's still on, I hope she is. You just put in some interesting bits and pieces that I'd missed about Michigan, Phoebe, if this is something that we need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, so sorry, I was just helping out on the tech side as well. So
multitasking.
So Michigan, they just had a significant jump in cases, and if you just had a quick look again, Biden's administration said no to sending more vaccines, saying that it's not going to work, that they actually just need to fully lock down. They have very strict mask mandates, they have very strict lockdown procedures, and it's all about variants. So kind of what we saw in November and December time here, we were looking down, but it wasn't doing enough.
A new and different variant, or an existing known variant that's found its way to Michigan?
Not known, although they did have the UK variant pretty quickly, and they were one of the states that suffered from that, but it could possibly be others. And I think that we forget how good we are at sequencing and like picking up those things. Yeah, so it's really hard to like tell where that is, but if you look at Michigan and you look at the rate, they've got a third of their population vaccinated, but they're doing incredibly badly in terms of case rate. So it's just important to like keep an eye on, same way you keep an eye on the rest of the world, where those little pockets of cases still going up, on top of like vaccination actually still working, which I know is something like the sense maker team has been looking at and thinking about, because you know it's nice to say for us vaccines are working, but really is it working everywhere? But yeah.
Thanks, Phoebe, and thank you to everybody. We're on 13:59. I've just fired a note from Andrew, interestingly, that resonates on banning free refills in restaurants on sugary drinks. I went to the shop on behalf of my colleague yesterday to purchase a Coke Zero for me and a full fat Coke for him, and noted that the price of a full fat Coke 250ml can is the same, 95 pence in Sainsbury's, as the price of a 330ml Coke Zero. And we think that must be because the sugar tax hadn't noticed it before. So very random end point on sugary drinks, but thank you very much, of course, to Paul and to Chris and to Andrew and Emily and Dylan and everybody else who came on to make a contribution, of course, James as well. We will continue to report out on David Cameron and Greensill, because that one I think is just going to run and run. There's lots for us to go at, and I think we have probably underdone a little bit on America, Bidenomics, and all of that side of things. And please do join us again. We're back tomorrow evening. There's no thinking tonight, but tomorrow evening we're doing race bias in healthcare. So join us for that. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Bye.